and welcome to this webinar from the Centre for Christianity in Society. Artificial intelligence has become a really hot topic over the last few years. It's seeped into popular culture recently in shows like Westworld and films like Ex Machina. And some people are very optimistic about the potential benefits of AI and even how it could transform what it means to be human. Other people are far less enthusiastic about it and have even predicted a future in which AI could threaten the existence of the human race itself. So what are we to make of all of this? How much of this is just wild speculation? And how should we engage as Christians in the discussion around AI? Well, these are some of the questions that we'll be talking about today, and I'm really delighted to be joined by Dr. John Lennox for the discussion. John is a Professor Emeritus of Mathematics at Oxford University, and he's the author of a number of books which explore the relationship between science and Christianity. His most recent one is called 2084, which is all about artificial intelligence. So thank you so much, John, for joining me today.
It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Great, thank you. And for those who are watching who perhaps don't know much about you, John, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, the first relevant thing is that I was brought up in Armagh and went to school there. And then I left Ireland and went to Cambridge for my formal education. And I spent 7 years in Cambridge and over 20 in Cardiff, teaching mathematics in the university, and I've ended up in Oxford where I've been for over 20 years. And during all of that time, in fact, since school days, I've been very interested in the interface between science, philosophy, and Christianity, because I'm just fascinated by the big questions.
Mm-hmm. And as we've just sort of mentioned, you have this new book out called 2084. So what led you to write this book about artificial intelligence?
Well, artificial intelligence raises huge questions, which we shall be discussing, particularly about the nature of human beings. When you go to the more science fiction side of it that you mentioned earlier in connection with Westworld and Ex Machina. And therefore, that was one of the questions. But I have for many years been interested in anything that raises questions about what we can do with human beings. Mm-hmm. And artificial general intelligence, that I'll define in a moment or two, I'm sure, it has to do with remodeling humanity itself. And through bioengineering and drugs and all kinds of artificial enhancements. Mm-hmm. And I did feel that somebody ought to write something. Now, some things had been written, and what precipitated it with me was being invited to give a lecture in London mm-hmm. to a large number of thinking people about the relationship of what was happening in the AI world and the early chapters of the book of Genesis. Mm-hmm. And as I was researching for that lecture, I discovered, to my great interest, that there was a vast amount to be explored, and it ended up in being a book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great, and you have this book now. So for those who have maybe read a little bit of George Orwell's work, they may see the connection between 2084 and one of his books. So can you tell us a little bit about the story behind the title? What made you go for 2084?
Well, of course, it's a takeoff from 1984, which is a dystopian scenario of the future, and introduced to the English language phrases like Big Brother and thought speak and all this kind of thing. And that reminds you instantly about the immense questions surrounding facial recognition technology today, particularly in its use in totalitarian regimes. But what gave me the title was a colleague from Oxford, Professor Peter Atkins, who's a renowned atheist, and he and I were traveling in a car together to do a debate which can be seen on my website. There's a pretty vigorous debate at that. And he asked me what I was writing, and I told him, and he said, I've got a title for you. And he came up with this title, which I thought was brilliant, and so does everybody else. So there it is.
Oh, very good. And so we're going to talk, obviously, John, about artificial intelligence, but for some of our viewers, they may not be aware that there are, broadly speaking, two types of AI. So what exactly do you mean by artificial intelligence? How would you define that? And then explain a little bit for us the two different types of AI.
Well, it's very important to bear in mind that there are two very different things, although they are related. There is, first of all, what's called narrow artificial intelligence, and that's the kind of thing that is operating at the moment. And it's got very positive benefits and a whole lot of ethical problems and difficulties. I often think that it's a bit like a knife. You can use it for surgery or you can use it for murder. So let's think of what a narrow AI system is. It involves a computer with huge crunching power. It involves a large database and software that enables it to recognize patterns within the data and print out answers to the questions that are inputted to it. For example, take 1 million X-rays of lungs, and that's your database. Label them using the best doctors in the world with the diseases that they represent. So you've got a big database of labeled pictures, and then you have something goes wrong with your lungs, your breathing difficulties, an X-ray is taken of your lungs, and it's compared with that huge database. And in a few seconds, out comes a diagnosis that your X-ray resembles this one, so you've probably got disease X. And in general, the diagnosis will be better than anything you get at the local hospital. Now, that can be thought of in many different medical scene areas. And indeed, at this very moment, artificial intelligence techniques of that kind are being used to develop a vaccine for COVID-19. So that's a very positive use of it. Another example, which is hugely important, is facial recognition technology. And one can immediately see the value of being able to recognize criminals or terrorists in a crowd. But then you begin to find that there's a downside, because the Uyghur population in Xinjiang in China is being monitored unbelievably, surveillance of the most intrusive kind. And the population is suffering. Indeed, many are in camps which look very like concentration camps, because the government wants to actually re-indoctrinate them and obliterate their culture. So that's a huge downside of that AI system. Now, let me emphasize, these are things that are already operating. The second kind of AI is AGI, Artificial General Intelligence. And that has essentially two forms. And it is generally described by what's called the Transhumanism project. That is to go beyond human. In what sense? Well, either you go beyond human by enhancing human beings by bioengineering, drugs, all kinds of implants, or you attempt to create some kind of silicon life, which is not dependent on carbon. It's not dependent on our concept of biology, and therefore is more endurable, in order to produce a super intelligence that is omnicompetent. So narrow AI is characterized by this. It does one thing and one thing alone that normally requires human intelligence to do. For example, recognition of disease. AGI is the much more futuristic idea of creating a super intelligence that outranks humans in every area. So that gives the general idea.
Sure, thank you. And you mentioned there transhumanism, and we'll come to talk about that a little bit later on. But I just wanted to focus on AGI then. What do you think are some of the risks that AGI poses? I mean, some people are talking about the existential risk that it could wipe out humanity itself. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts are not terribly important, but what leading people who have influence, particularly in governments and so on, think about it is very important. And there are two sides to the debate. There are the pessimists, techno-pessimists, and the techno-optimists. The pessimists are concerned that it may create a huge potential risk and even wipe out humanity. The late Stephen Hawking was one of those. Elon Musk is another who's raised very big questions about it. But on the other hand, there are techno-optimists who tend to think whatever can be done ought to be done. And this will bring huge benefits to humanity. What is often unsaid, of course, it'll bring huge benefits to the rich, and it'll drive a very much bigger wedge than exists at the moment between the rich and the poor. That is the kind of thing that people are concerned about. But a lot of it is, to my mind, is speculations, because if you want to imitate in any way and supersede human intelligence, you'll have to solve the problem of what is at the base of our intelligence, which is consciousness. It's very important to realize in this debate that words are misleading. We hear of an artificially intelligent system, but it's not intelligent. The computer is not intelligent. You see, it's been very well put by one of the pioneers in this area, and he said the word artificial in the phrase artificial intelligence is real. It just is like intelligence in the sense that its product is what normally requires intelligence, but there's no intelligence in it apart from the intelligence of the people that designed the machine and the program.
So John, speaking about transhumanism then, and this worldview that's growing in popularity, what do you think are some of the key differences between transhumanism and Christianity?
The best way to explain that, I think, is to refer to the work of Yuval Noah Harari, who's an Israeli historian that's written two runaway bestsellers, Sapiens and Homo Deus. And the second of those two books, Homo Deus, the man who is God, really explains the transhumanist program. And he has two agenda items for the 21st century. The first is the solution of the problem of physical death. And he reckons that's simply a technical problem. It will have a technical solution, which will mean, incidentally, that human beings will die, but they won't have to die. The second agenda item is what he proposes we will do with human beings. And he points out that we've been brought beyond the animal stage to the stage where we have intelligence and we've got all these abilities, but we're going to supersede that. We're going to, in particular, enhance human enjoyment and flourishing. And we'll do it by a combination of genetic engineering, implants, and all kinds of things like that, so that we shall move towards being gods with a small g, as he puts it. And that's a very ancient philosophy. And the roots of it you find at the beginning of the book of Genesis, where the human beings were tempted and told that if they ate the fruit of a forbidden tree, they would be as gods. And that was only a half truth. But the whole point is it has spawned those searchings for not only immortality, but for godlikeness. And here we meet them again in the 21st century. Now, you've asked me what is the difference between that and Christianity. The difference is utterly profound, because transhumanism and Harari think that the solution to the problem of physical death is in the future. Mm-hmm. And actually, it's not. The problem has already been solved. And the heart of Christianity, of course, is that Jesus Christ rose from the dead and promises to anybody who trusts him that they will receive what is called eternal life, and they will eventually be resurrected. So the idea of uploading human beings onto silicon, well, that is a pipe dream, but in any case, it's unnecessary, because Christ has offered this upload, so to speak, as a free gift to those who trust him, rather than as a product of endless engineering, which will probably never reach it. The second thing is that the heart of the Christian faith is the exact opposite of the Homo Deus project. Think about it. Homo Deus is humans reaching up to become gods. But Christianity centers around the incarnation, which is God becoming human, with a purpose of providing a basis for incorporating human beings who trust Christ into the family of God. Mm-hmm. And so it's the exact opposite movement. And one of my objectives in my book is to say, look, we are taking seriously, increasingly seriously, various visions of the future provided by thinkers about artificial intelligence. Isn't it about time we revisited the biblical scenario, which has the great advantage, at least in my view, of being not only credible, but true?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. What would you say then, John, to someone who maybe would come along and claim to be a Christian and say, well, why can't we have a bit of a mixture of both worldviews? You know, as Christians, God has designed us to be creative, to be inventive. And if we do have this technology that enables us to improve or upgrade our bodies, then wouldn't that be a good thing? What would you say to someone who would want to adopt some of the transhumanist values into their Christian faith?
Well, I would tend to say that insofar as what you are adding to humanity is within the biblical moral parameters, that's fine. We already do things. We enhance our capacity to see by using glasses. And increasingly, these enhancements become part of our bodies. I think the real problem comes when we're thinking of fulfilling the kind of project that C.S. Lewis warned off in the 1940s. That is the remaking of humans. Mm-hmm. And we are now at the stage, which nobody has ever been before, where we could do something. I say we, certain scientists, believe that they could modify the germline and the human genome so that all future generations would embody the modification we make today. And Lewis made the point that if that ever happens, what will be produced won't be human. It will actually be an artifact of certain scientists. And that's where he got the famous line where he said the final triumph will be the abolition of man. And I say to people, read Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man, and secondly, his book, That Hideous Strength, the science fiction book, if you want to understand what there is to be feared. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a plus and a minus. And artificial intelligence techniques, just stepping back from it a bit, are bringing great human benefit. I mentioned one in terms of the development of vaccines, new drugs, X-rays, and all this kind of thing. And we need to keep those in mind. But meddling about with the definition of humanity and seeking to provide or create humans 2.0, I think that's a very different thing, because the basic conviction, which drove me to write the book, is that human beings are made in the image of God. And it's worth watching Jordan Peterson talking about these things from his perspective, because on that particular statement, he said, this is the cornerstone of Western civilization, indeed of all civilization. And we neglect it to our peril. And that's what I fear. I would simply ask, what are you proposing to do?
Yeah.
Does it recognize that humans are made in the image of God? Now, the next observation I would make is that many people, including the people you have named, are strongly atheistic in their convictions. So there's a worldview dimension in transhumanism. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me to be deeply opposed to the Christian worldview. Mm-hmm. And if we ignore worldviews in our considerations of this, that is a very risky business. And that's one of the reasons, Michael, why I wrote the book, to draw people's attention, not only Christians' attention, but people's attention to what is involved here. It is not just a technological revolution. It is driven by a particular view, atheism in many cases, and in the end undermines the Christian value system. And if we believe that to be true, then we need to stand up and be counted.
Absolutely. And you say there that that really important biblical idea of human beings being created in the image of God, that gives value and dignity to humanity, whereas it seems like transhumanism really undermines the essential value of humanity. But another idea that we see in Scripture is a very central one, is the idea that God becomes man. Jesus Christ is God in the flesh. How do you think that also affirms the intrinsic value of humanity?
Well, in a very obvious way, that is so obvious that many people have never realized it. The statement that John makes at the beginning of his gospel, and the word became flesh, is an authentication of humans 1.0, that God has imparted such a dignity and unique specification to human beings 1.0 that he could become one. And the more I think about that, the more awe-inspiring I feel it is. It gives dignity not only to me, but to every other human being. It's the basis of treating them with respect. And it's the basis of not meddling with anything that could affect that concept negatively.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, John. And finally, then, how do you think that we as Christians can engage in this discussion on artificial intelligence?
Well, first of all, I think we should engage. And for Christians, it is an opportunity to talk about something that everybody is interested in. And again, I wrote the book to give them some information so that they could share that. And I really do believe that one of the best ways of engaging with people is not trying to teach them and give them the impression that we're somehow superior in what we know, but to proceed by asking our friends questions, what they make of AI, where do they feel it's going, does it raise questions in their minds, and get a discussion going that is genuinely two-sided, and wait, and here's the important thing, wait until our friends invite us to share what we think about it. So quick to listen and slow to speak, I think, is one of the very important things in any communication of the Christian message.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very, very helpful. Thank you so much for your time, John, today. And if you are watching this and you would like to pick up a copy of John's latest book, 2084, it's now available online and in paperback as well. So we'll have a link in the description. You can pick up a copy there. If you'd like to access more resources on how to think Christianly, you can visit our website. It's www.christianityinsociety.org. And until next time, goodbye.
Goodbye and thank you. You might also like to look at 2084book.com, which is a special website devoted to 2084, artificial intelligence and the future of humanity. Enjoy and thank you very much.